Snow drifted down in heavy silence, blanketing the small frontier town until the streets seemed carved from bone. Lanterns flickered dimly in the windows, yellow smudges against the pale storm, and the wind moved like a whisperer through the alleys, carrying gossip with more bite than the cold itself. She walked among it, Elena, no more than 22, but already marked by life as though she were years older. A thin shawl clung to her shoulders, worn too thin for winter, her breath spilling white in the air, her eyes lowered to the snow where her boots disappeared. She had once belonged here. Once she had walked these same streets as a bride, cheeks flushed with hope, the hem of her dress lifting off the dust of summer. But the frontier could be cruel to those who did not meet its demands, and crueler still were the people who lived by its rigid measure. She had not borne children. She had not been strong enough, some said, not sturdy like a wagon horse, nor made for the endless trials of the West. When her husband died, the whispers sharpened. His kin wanted no reminder of her. Too fragile, too cursed, a burden left behind. Now she lived on the outskirts in a cabin the snow tried daily to swallow, carrying buckets of water and firewood like penance. Neighbors turned away when she passed. Their eyes measured her beauty only to twist it into something pitiful, the kind of beauty wasted, the kind that promised nothing useful. The silence she endured was heavier than the storm. By the frozen pump that afternoon, she bent to lift the iron handle, her fingers stiff with cold. The pump groaned but gave little, the water slowed to rise. She pressed again, and her breath trembled. Her arms, slim as birch branches, strained, but the weight of the bucket seemed to grow. She braced her boot in the snow, pulling with all the force left in her small frame. The pump clanged, the bucket slipped, and for a moment her composure cracked. Her head bowed low, and she whispered something only the snow could hear. A shadow fell across the white. He had been there, watching perhaps, or simply passing with the patience of a man who had no hurry in his bones. Tall, broad-shouldered, with hair white as the frost, Silas Boone stepped forward. He was known by all and known by none, a figure both respected and dismissed. Folks called him the old cowboy, though 45 was not so very old in years, only in the way hardship had carved him. His face bore the weather of a life lived against wind and sun, handsome in its stern lines, but marked with solitude. He was not a man people confided in, nor one they invited to their tables. He had carved his own table, on land no one else wanted, and it was enough for him. Without a word, he took hold of the handle, the veins of his forearm flexing with quiet strength, and water spilled into the bucket with ease. He lowered it, lifted it, and set it at her feet as though it weighed nothing. He did not linger, nor did he offer pity, only a nod, and the faintest trace of a courtesy that made her heart stir with something she had not felt in months, acknowledgment. Elena's lips parted to thank him, but the words dissolved. He was already turning, snow gathering on the brim of his hat, boots pressing deep marks into the street. She bent to lift the bucket, and this time it did not seem so heavy. Over the days that followed, she saw him again. Not often, but enough to feel as though fate was nudging them along the same path. A pile of chopped firewood stacked neatly against a cabin wall. No note, but only one man in town had hands steady enough to cut with such precision. A wagon wheel she had struggled with freed quietly the next morning. When she passed through town, head lowered against the murmur of voices, she felt his eyes catch hers across the street. He would tip his hat, nothing more, yet the gesture was a lifeline in the sea of indifference. It was not conversation that grew between them, but a thread of small mercies. She began to notice details, the way his gaze lingered not on her beauty but on her effort, the slight bow of his back that revealed years of labor, the patience in his silence that made her own silence less unbearable. But the town noticed too. In a place where survival meant fitting into the mold others carved, any deviation was a crack in the ice. Whispers rose, sharper than ever. What business did a man like Silas have with a woman like her? She was barren, they said. A curse. A weight no man would carry unless he was desperate. She walked through their mutterings like someone marked, her shame pressed deeper into her chest. Yet beneath it flickered something fragile, hope, though she feared to name it. One evening, as the sky bruised with the coming storm, she crossed the square, her shawl drawn tight. A group of men leaned near the saloon, their voices slurred, their laughter cruel. Words cut the air. Look at her. Can't even keep a man alive, let alone give him sons. Another jeered. Old Boone's got strange taste. Guess he's so starved for company he'd take the town's leftovers. Elena stiffened, her steps faltering. The snow swallowed her sound, but inside her chest something cracked like glass. She lowered her head, willing herself to vanish. But before she could slip past, the laughter stilled. Silas had stepped from the shadows, his frame filling the space between her and their sneers. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The storm was in his eyes, steady and cold, a warning carved in silence. His hands rested at his sides, but every man there felt the weight of them. The jeers faltered, then died. One by one they looked away, muttering into their collars, retreating back into the saloon's dim light. Elena's breath caught. The bucket of shame she had carried so long felt suddenly lighter, as though he had taken it from her without touching it. She did not speak to him, nor he to her, but when she turned homeward, the storm at her back felt less bitter. That night she sat by the hearth, the flames licking weakly at the logs. She thought of the way he had stood there, not as a hero, not as a man seeking glory, but simply as someone unwilling to let her dignity be trampled. Her hands tightened around the cup of tea, and warmth spread through her chest. For the first time in many seasons, she wondered if perhaps she was not entirely invisible after all. And though she could not yet name what stirred between them, she knew the silence of winter had shifted. Something was beginning. The days that followed carried the sharp edge of rumor, slicing through every corner of the town. Men spoke in half-whispers over whiskey glasses, women pressed their lips together as she passed, children repeated words they barely understood. Elena felt it all, the weight of their eyes, the judgment that turned her existence into something shameful. Yet each evening, when the snow deepened and silence stretched wide, she found traces of his presence. Silas Boone was never far. A repaired shutter, a stack of hay shifted closer to her shed, a lantern left burning near her path when the storm grew dark. He did not ask if she wanted his help. He gave it quietly, as though dignity was a gift best offered in silence. Still, the voices of others grew louder. She tried to convince herself it would be safer if he left her be. Safer for him. He had a place in this world, if not warm, at least solid. She had nothing to give but shame, and she hated the thought of dragging him into her ruin. More than once she considered telling him so. But whenever he stood near her, when his steady gaze brushed hers, when his weathered hand lingered a moment too long on a task meant for her, she found the words withered away. Winter deepened. A storm swept the valley with such fury that even the town's most hardened men barred their doors in fear. Elena's cabin groaned under the burden of snow. She sat by the fire, listening to the timbers creak, and when the roof gave its final cry, she knew it would not hold. She tried to gather what she could, but the door burst open in a sweep of white, and there he was, his shoulders dusted in frost, his eyes sharp with urgency. He took her by the arm, not with force but with certainty, and pulled her into the storm. Behind them, the roof caved, wood cracking under the weight. Her home vanished into the blizzard's howl. He lifted her onto his horse as if she weighed nothing and rode through the white chaos, the beast's breath steaming like smoke. She pressed against him, the leather of his coat cold at first, then warmer with every heartbeat. She had never felt so small, nor so fiercely protected. By the time they reached his homestead, she was trembling, but not from the storm. He carried her inside, set her near the fire, and moved about with the unhurried assurance of a man who had faced many winters alone. His cabin was plain but strong, its walls built thick, its hearth alive with flame. She stared at the warmth as though it were a miracle. That night, the wind screamed against the walls, but inside there was calm. He gave her food, simple stew and bread, and sat across from her, his face lit by the fire. Neither spoke much, yet the silence was not empty. It was full of something unspoken, something that pressed gently between them. When her eyes finally lifted to his, she found not pity there but recognition, as though he had carried loneliness long enough to understand hers. Morning broke cold and brittle, the snow glittering like shards of glass. Yet before the day could breathe, the sound of boots approached his homestead. Men stood outside, their voices sharp against the quiet. Elena froze at the window, her chest tightening as she recognized the faces. They had come not to help, but to condemn. "Boone," one of them called, his breath steaming, his tone edged with contempt. "You know what she is. Send her out. Don't drag the rest of us into her curse." Another voice rose. "You've lived by yourself too long. Don't think we'll watch you ruin yourself for her. She's not worth the trouble." Elena's stomach twisted. She felt the old shame rushing back, hotter than any fire. She wanted to speak, to beg him not to risk himself for her, but her voice failed. Before she could move, Silas opened the door. He stepped onto the porch with the quiet confidence of a man who needed no weapon to be dangerous. Snow caught in his white hair, melting on his shoulders, and his eyes held a stillness that made the gathered men shift uneasily. "She will not leave," he said, his voice calm, deep, certain. "And if any man here thinks otherwise, let him speak now and answer to me." Silence fell heavy. The men glanced at one another, their bravado shrinking under his gaze. They had expected anger, a fight they could twist into righteousness. Instead, they found something harder to meet, a man standing in unshakable resolve. No gun drawn, no curse shouted, only truth carried in his stillness. One by one, their eyes faltered. Boots shuffled in the snow, shoulders hunched, and soon the crowd dissolved, muttering excuses into the wind. Not one dared step forward. Elena watched from inside, her hands trembling against the windowsill. She saw him standing there alone, a sentinel in the snow, and for the first time in her life she understood what it meant for someone to choose her, not for what she could give, but for who she was. When he returned inside, he found her waiting by the fire, her eyes wet but shining with something stronger than sorrow. The storm outside softened, the world blanketed in a fragile hush. Days later, when the church bell rang in the thaw of spring, it was for them. Their vows were spoken simply, without grandeur, yet the room carried a reverence that silence often holds. She looked into his eyes and saw not rescue, but partnership. He looked into hers and saw not fragility, but endurance. And though the West remained as hard and merciless as ever, they had defied it together. In that defiance was a kind of victory no gossip could undo, a quiet triumph that belonged to them alone. The story of their union spread, not in whispers of shame, but in the hushed awe of those who had witnessed it. For Elena, the winter no longer lived in her bones. For Silas, the solitude no longer haunted his nights. What they found in each other was not loud, not sudden, but steady, a fire built log by log, lasting through the storm.